Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one we see that the majority or every one of the changes is in the southern part of the Donetsk region. That's not to say that not a lot has happened, because significant developments have taken place. The Russians have captured and secured the river line here by the Vatne in the southwest. They have advanced in the direction of Novoukrainka west of Selydove. They've advanced and gained a foothold within Shakhtars'ke, Novoukrainka, and Bohoyavlenka. The Russians have secured the area of control northeast of Kurakhove and along Alexandropol. The Russians have gained full control over Selydove, completely gaining every single building within the settlement, and they've managed to recapture some lost positions north of Novoukrainka. Now, starting out in the south, we see that the Russians have secured the entire river line here north of Priotne near Levatne. This will allow for stronger pushes on the flanks of Vuhledar, crossing the river towards Novodarivka and Rifnopil, and stronger flanks here by the fortified positions of the Ukrainians northwest of Selydove. In the eastern direction, with the capture of the area west of Selydove, the Russians have secured their hold over the settlement itself. In the northern direction, the Russians have stormed Shakhtars'ke itself, to the point the deep state map has left the entire settlement in the grey zone, without just a small part in the southeast, which is under Russian control. So you see that the Russians have not just gained the foothold, but due to the heavy shelling of the settlement, which was covered in the last video, the Ukrainian positions within the settlement have completely been disrupted, and the last remaining positions of the Ukrainians are by the fortified positions outside of the settlement, while the settlement itself has been abandoned by the Ukrainian forces. So the Russians will likely gain quick control over the settlement with these developments. In the east, the Russians have captured several fortified positions and have gained control over several of the fields and forest lines in between Novoukrainka and Shakhtars'ke, with the recent reports that they've gained a foothold within Shakhtars'ke as well, both in the farm area in the western outskirts of the settlement and in the southern outskirts of the settlement. Here the Ukrainians still remain within the settlement and have gained still massive fortifications to the north of the settlement, which they also occupy and overlook the settlement from. The Novoukrainka is more difficult for the Russians to push through, but they have now a direct road from Prichistivka to Novoukrainka, which they can make use of to transport and launch further offensive operations towards the settlement. In the direction of Bohoyavlenka, the Russians have secured the western flank and are fighting within the settlement. The entire settlement is also in the grey zone, similar to Shakhtars'ke. So we see that these three settlements are seeing very heavy fights by the Russians, which could indicate that they are launching these operations to quickly gain control over all three of these settlements. This will allow a significant change in this section of the front line. Zodiac Maps wrote an analysis based on this and these developments. How can these take place? He says, the capture of Vuhledar has been the turning point in the battle for southwestern Donetsk Oblast. After the fall of this Ukrainian stronghold and its strategic Attrition, the Russian army can monitor Ukrainian movements in a wide area, which makes the Ukrainian defense no longer as effective. Artillery is more effective in locating Ukrainian positions, and Russian assaults are becoming more frequent from several axes, allowing much faster advances than those that occurred east of the TO524 highway. With all this, it should be noted that the Ukrainian army will try to hold this front with all its forces, since its fall would mean the loss of Kurakhove and a section of the H15 highway that leads to Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. So we see that there is a highway that goes directly from the southern flank of Donetsk through Marinka, through Kurakhove, and all the way through to the Dnipro Oblast. This is something that the Ukrainians really want to defend, because as we see, there are a lot of fortified positions along the southern parts of the Donetsk region, well, the entirety of the Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia regions, but not really anything in the Dnipro region. So if the Ukrainians lose their fortified positions here in the south of the Donetsk region, their next positions would be vulnerable and open. Even in these areas, there are several fortified positions that the Ukrainians make use of. Despite that, the Russians push through them fairly quickly. Now imagine the scenario where there is no fortified positions. How would the Russian advances look like at that point? And that is exactly what the Ukrainians want to avoid. But this also means that they have to commit more units to the fighting, and therefore would take more losses, and the Battle of Attrition would speed up. Based on this, we can see and say that the fall of Vuhledar has been devastating for the Ukrainians, considering the ginormous advances the Russians have made possible due to that. Here in the direction of Kurakhove, we see the Russians have captured the northeastern outskirts along the river line, where they have secured the northern flank for potential offensive operations directly into the eastern parts of Kurakhove through the fortified positions, where we have this video here which shows a TOS strike on the Ukrainian fortified positions here near the front line. If such strikes are effective, the Russians can move on, storm them to gain control of them, securing the northern parts of the highway, allowing for further offensive operations along the fortified positions closer to Kurakhove itself. The Russians have also secured the area north of Attrition along the Vuhledar river line. So we see that the Russians now have a strong position near Attrition and Vuhledar, where they before only had a thin dive into the back of the Ukrainian lines. There's also the fact that the Russians have been able to make such operations, yet the Ukrainians have failed to make a organized counterattack, which shows the limited capabilities they have in this region. In the direction of Selydove, the Russians first managed to gain control over the southern parts and the eastern parts of the residential area, pushing the Ukrainians to the outskirts of the settlement, after which the Russians now have full control over the outskirts as well, giving 100% full control over the settlement, the city of Selydove, which had a pre-war population of about 22,000 people. So we see that this area is now under Russian control, and again this has a significant impact on this section of the front line. I previously said, imagine if there were no fortified positions. Well, here we get the answer to that, because there is no fortified position west of Selydove. This village chain along the railway is almost completely undefended. The Ukrainian soldiers are standing within the buildings, the forest lines, and that's it. There's no trenches dug, there's no fortified positions. Even if they dig trenches that haven't been detected by drones or satellite imagery yet, we get the example of the ones built near Irnik and Kurakhove. If we take a look at this footage here, we can see it is of course low bitrate. It is frontline footage, low connection, probably jamming. The trenches here we can see they are dug. There's no concrete fortifications, there's no extra fortifications. It's simply trenches dug, and that's all they have to defend themselves. And this shows the vulnerability of these trenches. That means if the Ukrainians manage to build some fortifications, it will naturally help, but the help will be very limited, especially if they don't have the time to prepare the necessary defenses. If the Russians managed to take advantage of the capture of Selydove to capture this chain of settlements of Novoukrainka all the way to the defensive line of the Ukrainians near Pokrovsk, the front line will be double as wide, and the fortified positions are much weaker near Shevchenko through to Pokrovsk than they are from the Sivka, Sukhia and Dachenske towards Pokrovsk. So the Russians will have a stronger point from there. They'll also be able to attack the fortified positions of the Ukrainians from a weaker point, both here in the middle direction in between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove, but also to flank the Ukrainian positions near Kurakhove. So we see that once the Russians have completely cleared the settlement, because they have captured the entirety of it, they haven't made sure that all of the Ukrainian soldiers there within it have given up. They need to clear basements, they need to clear every single building before they can then use it as a base and implement further offensive operations from there. But once they have done so, we'll likely see several offensive operations in multiple directions to expand the front line and simply to capture more territory, push the Ukrainians back, and start the siege of Pokrovsk and Kurakhove. Near Novoukrainka, the Ukrainians counterattacked to gain control over some parts of the fortified line and tried to re-enter Novoukrainka. The Russians recently recaptured that to secure the defensive positions here north of Novoukrainka. A topic has arisen, and that is, why do the Russians not close the gap? There was such a small gap, why didn't the Russians close it? They would have captured the remaining Ukrainian soldiers, they would have given up. or they would have fought until the end, but the Russians would not let anyone escape. This brings us to another question, a different question. That is, why did I expect that the Ukrainians would hole up in the apartment complex buildings and do a last stand, but instead we saw them withdraw and escape outside the western parts? Well, this brings us back to the Battle of Vuhledar. We see Vuhledar is just the apartment complex buildings. It is a well-fortified city, yet they lost it fairly quickly. One of the reasons is that the 72nd Mechanized Brigade decided to withdraw from the city. And this soldier explains just exactly how costly it is to withdraw from a city that is semi-encircled. The soldier said it was too dangerous for Ukrainian armored personnel carriers to drive towards friendly lines because of Russian artillery and drone attacks. Instead, he described how individual units were trying to quietly slip out of the Russian encirclement at night in fighting retreat formations. On average, if 10 people leave the city in groups, 4 to 6 make it out, he said. This means that it is about 50% casualty rate to escape a semi-encircled city. This means the Russians had two options. Option 1 is to fully encircle the city. Whatever remains of the Ukrainian side will hole up in the apartment complex buildings, they'll make a last stand, and they'll continue fighting until they are all gone. If there's 1,000 soldiers, then the Ukrainians would lose 1,000 soldiers, but the Russians would have to expend a lot of equipment, they would have to expend a lot of time, and they would have to do a lot of stuff. That would be very costly to do so. And it will allow the Ukrainians to build new fortified positions, to allow the Ukrainians to establish new lines. Now we see that the Russians have captured Selydove within just a few days, in less than a week. Some even said, oh, the Russians may capture Selydove before November. We are still 5 days from November. That is how quickly the Russians have captured Selydove. It is a city, pre-war population of over 20,000. There were several brigades of the Ukrainians sent to defend the city, yet the Russians captured it so quickly. And if we take the previous example, 50% are going to be lost anyways in the withdrawal from the city. This means that they speed it up, they lose so much less equipment, time, and manpower. The units are not exhausted, they still have a lot of equipment, yet they still inflict 50% of the casualties, and that is a very cost-effective way for the Russians to move. The Russians simply do this time and time again, from one settlement to another, and they keep achieving the same effect. Eventually, they'll be able to wipe out the Ukrainian army without even fighting them, and that is exactly what they are aiming for. They're simply doing more of the same thing, and the Ukrainians keep falling into the same trap because there's no way to deal with it. They can either give up their settlements completely, which will leave them in positions that aren't even fortified because they do not have enough troops. This is why the Ukrainian Kursk incursion really screwed up the Ukrainian defenses in the Donetsk region, because now they do not have the necessary forces to prevent the Russians from enveloping the cities. And this has led to much more casualties being taken by the Ukrainian side at a much faster rate, and it allows the Russians to capture more territory at a much faster rate. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.